This was never supposed to be a real marriage, just a signature, a contract, and 6 months of pretending. But somehow, she became the only thing holding his empire together. The chandelier light shimmered across a room full of polished smiles and tailored suits, the kind of place where every handshake meant power and every glance carried judgment. And at the center of it all stood Lily Harper, her fingers trembling slightly as they held a bouquet that cost more than she used to make in a month. Her reflection caught in the mirrored walls. No longer the girl in a janitor's uniform pushing a mop down silent hallways at 2 a.m., but a woman dressed in white, standing at the altar beside a man who owned half the skyline outside those floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan Caldwell didn't look at her at first, his jaw set, his posture perfect, every inch the untouchable, so the board demanded he remain. And when he finally leaned closer, his voice was low, controlled, almost detached. "Remember, this is still fake." And just like that, the weight of the contract folded in Lily's hand, pressed heavier than the diamond ring on her finger, a quiet reminder that this wasn't love, wasn't even choice. It was a deal, one that began on a night no one else in that room would ever imagine. Just weeks earlier, the building had been empty, the kind of silence that only comes after midnight when ambition finally sleeps. And Lily had been alone with her cart, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her, the scent of industrial cleaner clinging to the air as she moved methodically across the executive floor, her sneakers soft against marble that didn't belong to her world. And she hadn't expected anyone else to be there, especially not him. Ethan Caldwell was supposed to be somewhere else entirely, negotiating with investors or closing deals worth more than she could comprehend. But instead, he stood at the far end of the hallway, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, staring through the glass walls of the boardroom like a man watching something fall apart in slow motion. And Lily would have walked past quietly, like she always did, unseen, unnoticed. But then she heard it, voices raised just enough behind the closed doors, fragments of conversations slipping through the cracks. "You need stability, Ethan," one voice insisted, sharp and impatient. "Investors want a family man, not a risk." Another added, colder, "No marriage, no confidence vote." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Lily had carried that night. Because when the door opened and those men stepped out, their eyes passed right over her, as if she were part of the furniture, leaving Ethan alone in the dim light, his expression unreadable until it wasn't. He turned, suddenly aware of her presence, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, him in a tailored suit worth thousands, her in a faded uniform with a name tag slightly crooked, two worlds colliding in the quietest way possible. And then he did something neither of them expected, something that would rewrite everything that came after. He walked toward her, stopped just close enough that she could see the exhaustion behind his controlled exterior, and said, without hesitation, without warmth, but with absolute certainty, "You'll do." And Lily blinked, unsure if she had heard him right, her grip tightening around the handle of her mop. "I'm sorry," she asked, her voice steady despite the confusion rising in her chest. And Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek folder, flipping it open with practiced precision, revealing pages of neatly printed terms, signatures waiting to be written, a future she hadn't asked for already outlined in black ink. "Marry me," he said, as if it were the most logical solution in the world. "On paper. 6 months. You get paid. I get what I need." And the fluorescent lights hummed louder in the silence that followed. Because in that moment, Lily Harper realized this wasn't just an offer. It was a crossroads, one that would pull her from the shadows of a cleaning shift into a world where pretending might cost her far more than she was prepared to lose. Lily did not answer right away, not because she did not understand what he was asking, but because she understood it too well, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. The contract sat open between them, pages crisp and cold under the fluorescent lights, outlining a life that felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. And for a moment all she could hear was the quiet hum above and the steady beat of her own heart as she looked at Ethan Caldwell. Really looked at him, not as the name whispered in news headlines or printed on business magazines, but as a man standing alone in an empty hallway at nearly 2 in the morning asking a stranger to become his wife like it was a business transaction. "You do not even know me," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, and Ethan did not hesitate. "I know enough," he replied, his tone clipped, efficient, as if emotions were variables he had long ago removed from every equation. "You need money. I need a wife. This solves both problems." And there it was, simple, transactional, clean on paper, but anything but in reality. And Lily almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal, like stepping into a story that was not written for someone like her. She glanced down at her hands, faint traces of cleaning solution still lingering on her skin despite the gloves she had worn all night. And for a second she thought about walking away, about pushing her cart down the hall and pretending this never happened, because people like him did not enter her world and offer solutions. They passed through it without noticing. But then reality pressed back in, sharp and unforgiving, like it always did. Her rent overdue by 2 weeks, the voicemail from the hospital she had not returned yet, her mother's medication running low, each thought stacking on top of the next until the weight of them felt heavier than any decision she had ever made. "How much?" she asked quietly, and something in Ethan's expression shifted, not softer, but more certain, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. He named a number that made her chest tighten, more money than she had ever seen at once, enough to cover the bills, enough to breathe again, and still she hesitated, because it was never just about money. "And after 6 months," she pressed, "we go back to being strangers." Ethan nodded without pause. "That is the agreement," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "No personal attachment, no interference in my business. Decisions, you attend events when required. You follow instructions, and you keep this confidential." Each rule landed like a line drawn in permanent ink, boundaries meant to protect him, not her, and Lily felt it, the imbalance, the risk, the quiet warning beneath every word. Yet something else flickered beneath it too, something he was not saying, something she could not fully read but could feel in the way his shoulders carried tension even when his voice remained steady. "And if I say no?" she asked, testing the edges of this moment. And for the first time, Ethan paused, just briefly. "Then you walk away," he answered. "And nothing changes for either of us." But that was not entirely true, because Lily knew exactly what would change for her. The same bills, the same uncertainty, the same long nights that led nowhere. And she realized then that this was not just his deal. It was her chance, flawed and risky and complicated, but a chance nonetheless. She exhaled slowly, reached for the pen resting neatly inside the folder, and before she could second-guess herself, before fear could speak louder than necessity, she signed her name, Lily Harper, the ink still fresh as she handed it back, and Ethan closed the folder with a decisive snap, sealing something far bigger than a contract, because in that quiet hallway, under those humming lights, 2 strangers had just agreed to rewrite each other's lives without fully understanding the cost. By the time the sun rose over the city, Lily Harper no longer belonged to the quiet corners of empty hallways and late-night cleaning shifts, because everything changed faster than she could process. Beginning with a black car waiting outside her apartment building at exactly 7 in the morning, its polished surface reflecting a version of her life that still felt unreal. She stood there for a moment, keys in hand, staring at it like it might disappear if she blinked, but it did not, and neither did the man stepping out from the driver's seat in a tailored suit who simply nodded and said, "Miss Harper, we have a full schedule today," as if this had always been her life, as if she had always been expected somewhere important. And the strange part was not just the car or the driver or the fact that she was suddenly being addressed with quiet respect. It was how quickly she realized there was no turning back, not after signing that contract, not after choosing this path. The ride to Ethan's penthouse felt like moving through 2 different worlds at once. The streets she knew fading behind tinted windows as glass towers rose higher around her, until the car finally stopped in front of a building she had only ever seen from a distance, its entrance framed by marble and silence, the kind of place where everything felt expensive even before you stepped inside. And when she did, following the driver through the lobby, she became painfully aware of every detail about herself, the simplicity of her clothes, the way her shoes echoed too loudly against the floor, the subtle glances from people who were trying not to stare but clearly noticed she did not belong. And then the elevator doors opened to a private floor where Ethan Caldwell was already waiting, standing near the windows with the city stretched out behind him like something he owned. Because in many ways, he did. He did not greet her with a smile, did not ask if she was comfortable. Instead, he handed her another folder, thinner this time, but no less precise. "Your schedule," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "Training begins today." And Lily took it, flipping through pages that outlined everything from etiquette lessons to wardrobe fittings to public appearances, each line another step away from the person she had been just 24 hours ago. "You are serious about this," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. And Ethan's response came without hesitation. "I am always serious about what is necessary." And that was when she understood something important. This was not about pretending for him. This was about survival, about maintaining control in a world where perception could determine everything. And now she was part of that equation, whether she fully understood it or not. The next few hours blurred into a sequence of instructions and expectations, a stylist measuring her without small talk, a consultant correcting the way she stood, the way she spoke, even the way she held a glass of water, every detail refined until it no longer felt like her. Until she caught her reflection again, this time not in a window, but in a full-length mirror, surrounded by soft lighting. And for a moment she did not recognize the woman staring back, polished, composed, almost convincing. And yet something deeper remained unchanged, something quiet but steady. Because as overwhelming as everything felt, Lily was still watching, still observing. And when she glanced at the documents left open on a nearby table, reports filled with numbers and notes about declining performance, failed projects, internal conflicts, she did not look away like she was supposed to. Instead, she paused, her eyes scanning quickly, patterns forming in her mind almost instinctively, small inconsistencies that did not quite add up. And she realized then that this world, as foreign as it seemed, was not entirely beyond her understanding, not as much as Ethan might assume. And when he walked back into the room, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease, he caught her looking, just for a second, their eyes meeting across the space, and something unspoken passed between them. Curiosity on his side, something sharper on hers, because this arrangement might have started as his solution, but Lily Harper was beginning to see that it might not end the way he expected. The next few days moved with a precision that left no room for hesitation, each hour planned, each step measured, as if Lily's life had been placed on a track that could only move forward. And the strangest part was not the speed of it all, but how quickly people began to accept her presence, not because they knew her, but because Ethan Caldwell stood beside her, and in his world, that was enough. The first event came sooner than she expected, a private dinner with investors held on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the city, the kind of place where conversations were quiet but decisions carried weight far beyond the room. And as the car pulled up, Lily felt the familiar tension in her chest, the same feeling she used to get before stepping into a room where she knew she did not belong. Except this time, she did not have the option to stay invisible. This time, every eye would be on her, measuring, questioning, deciding if she fit into a role she had only just begun to understand. Ethan noticed it, not her fear exactly, but the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her clutch, and for a brief moment, his voice softened just enough to be almost human. "Stay close, follow my lead, and do not overthink it," he said, and Lily glanced at him, searching for something more, reassurance, maybe, but all she found was control, the same steady confidence that never seemed to crack. And so she nodded, because that was the role she had agreed to play. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations paused, eyes turned, and smiles appeared that did not quite reach people's eyes. Polite, calculated, curious, and Lily could feel it, the silent questions hanging in the air. Who is she? Where did she come from? How did she end up here? And for a second, she almost retreated into herself, almost let the weight of those questions push her back into the background where she had always been safe. But then something unexpected happened, not from Ethan, not from anyone else, but from within her, a quiet decision, a reminder that she had not come this far just to stand silently beside someone else's life. The conversation at the table turned to numbers quickly, declining quarterly results, a failed expansion, tension wrapped in polite language, and Lily listened, at first out of habit, then with growing focus. Because the patterns she had noticed earlier began to connect, small details aligning into something clearer, something no one else seemed to be addressing directly. And when one of the investors made a comment about cutting operational costs in a way that would have clearly damaged the company further, she did something she was not supposed to do. She spoke. That would only fix the surface, she said, her voice steady despite the sudden silence that followed, and every head turned toward her, including Ethan's, his expression unreadable but sharper now. The problem is not cost, she continued, carefully, choosing each word. It is inefficiency in how resources are being used. You are losing value before it even reaches the point where cost-cutting would matter. The room stayed quiet for a moment longer than comfortable, and Lily could feel it, the risk of what she had just done, stepping outside the lines of the role she had been given. But then one of the older investors leaned forward slightly, interest replacing skepticism. And how exactly would you suggest addressing that? He asked, and Lily did not hesitate, because she already knew. You start by looking at where the breakdown actually happens, not where it becomes visible. And as she spoke, something shifted, not just in the room, but in Ethan, because for the first time since this arrangement began, he was not watching her as a placeholder or a solution. He was watching her as something else entirely, something he had not accounted for. And when the conversation moved on, subtly but undeniably influenced by her input, he leaned slightly closer and said in a low voice, "You were not supposed to do that." And Lily met his gaze without backing down. "Maybe that is the problem," she replied, and for a brief moment, the controlled world Ethan Caldwell had built felt just a little less certain, because the woman he had hired to play a role was beginning to change the script. The moment they stepped out of the elevator that night, the silence between them felt different, no longer neutral, no longer just part of the arrangement, but charged with something neither of them had planned for. And Ethan did not speak immediately, his pace steady as he walked ahead, his expression unreadable, yet Lily could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, she had disrupted his world in a way that could not simply be ignored. When they reached the car, he stopped, turning to face her fully, his eyes sharper now, more focused than before. "Do you understand what you did in there?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that had not been there earlier. And Lily held his gaze, refusing to shrink back into the role he had defined for her. "I said what needed to be said," she replied, her tone steady, and for a brief second, something flickered in his expression. Not anger exactly, but something closer to frustration mixed with curiosity, as if he was trying to decide whether she had crossed a line or revealed something he had been unwilling to see. "You are here to support the image," he said, each word measured, not to challenge the strategy. And Lily felt the weight of that statement, the reminder of the boundaries he believed were absolute. But instead of stepping back, she took a small step forward, just enough to make her point without raising her voice. "Then maybe the image is part of the problem," she said quietly. And the air between them stilled again, because this was no longer about a contract or a role. This was about perspective, about two completely different ways of seeing the same reality. And for the first time since this began, Ethan did not immediately respond. The ride back to the penthouse passed in silence, but it was not empty. It was filled with thoughts neither of them voiced. Lily replaying the conversation in her mind, questioning whether she had pushed too far, while Ethan considered something far less comfortable, the possibility that she might have been right. Over the next few days, the change did not happen all at once, but it was there in small moments, subtle shifts that only someone paying close attention would notice. Ethan began asking questions during meetings that he had not asked before, looking deeper into reports instead of accepting surface explanations, and more than once, his gaze would linger on Lily just a second longer, as if measuring her in a way that went beyond the role she was supposed to play. And Lily, in turn, found herself drawn further into the world she had once only observed from a distance, no longer just watching but understanding, connecting pieces, seeing patterns that others overlooked. And yet she remained careful, aware that every step forward came with risk, because she was still the outsider, still the one who did not officially belong. The real shift came late one evening, back in the same quiet office where this all began, when Ethan found her standing near the glass wall, looking over a set of reports she was not supposed to access. And instead of stopping her, instead of reminding her of the rules, he walked closer, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than before. "What do you see?" he asked, and Lily hesitated for just a moment. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the significance of the question. This was not about curiosity anymore. This was an opening, a choice, and when she finally spoke, her words were clear, direct. "I see a company that is trying to fix symptoms instead of the cause," she said, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not dismiss it. Instead, he watched her, really listened, as she pointed to specific details, inefficiencies, decisions that looked right on paper but failed in execution. And as she spoke, something changed again, not just in how he saw the company, but in how he saw her, because the woman standing in front of him was no longer just a temporary solution or a convenient arrangement. She was becoming something far more complicated and far more valuable than he had ever intended. And for the first time since he offered that contract, Ethan Caldwell realized that this might not be a situation he could fully control anymore. It did not happen all at once, but somewhere between late-night reports and early morning meetings, the distance between them began to shift in ways neither of them acknowledged out loud, because it was easier to pretend that everything was still defined by the contract, still controlled, still temporary, even as the reality slowly moved beyond those boundaries. Lily found herself no longer waiting to be told what to do. Instead, she started anticipating problems before they were spoken, leaving notes on reports, marking inconsistencies, suggesting small adjustments that seemed almost insignificant until they were not, until those small changes began to ripple through the company in ways that could not be ignored. And Ethan noticed, not just the results, but the pattern behind them, the way her mind worked, precise yet intuitive, grounded in something real rather than theoretical. And it unsettled him more than he expected, because control had always been his advantage, his certainty in a world built on calculated decisions. But Lily did not follow calculations the same way. She saw things differently. And somehow, she was not wrong. One evening, long after the rest of the office had emptied, Ethan stood in the doorway of the conference room watching her without announcing himself. Lily was leaning over the table, sleeves slightly pushed back, completely absorbed in the data spread out in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration, unaware of how out of place and yet completely natural she looked in that space. And for a moment, he did not see the cleaner he had hired or the role she was supposed to play. He saw someone who belonged there in a way that challenged everything he thought he understood. "You are staying later than required," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. And Lily looked up, startled but not embarrassed. "So are you," she replied simply. And there was something in the exchange that felt different, less like a hierarchy and more like an equal ground neither of them had planned to stand on. He stepped inside, setting his jacket aside, his gaze shifting to the documents in front of her. "What are you working on?" he asked. And this time, there was no hesitation in her answer. "Your logistics chain," she said, pointing to a series of numbers that did not align. "There is a gap here. It looks small, but it repeats across multiple departments. That is where the losses are coming from." Ethan moved closer, his attention narrowing as he followed her explanation. And for the first time, he saw it clearly, not as isolated issues, but as a pattern that had gone unnoticed because no one had thought to look at it from her perspective. And he felt something unexpected, not just surprise, but a quiet respect that was difficult to ignore. The room fell silent again, but it was not uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of understanding, of something forming that neither of them had defined yet. And then Ethan said something he had not said to anyone in a long time. "Stay." Just one word. Simple but different. Not an order, not part of the contract, but something else entirely. And Lily looked at him, searching his expression for the usual distance, the usual control, but it was not there in the same way. "I am already here," she replied softly. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because this was no longer just about fixing a company or maintaining an image. It was about a connection neither of them had expected, something growing in the space between obligation and choice. And even though neither of them said it, both of them understood that the line between what was real and what was not had begun to blur, and once that line disappears, it is almost impossible to draw it again. The shift did not go unnoticed. Not by the people who had built their power quietly within the company long before Lily ever stepped into that polished world. And it began subtly, with lingering looks during meetings, conversations that stopped just a second too late when she entered a room, and emails that seemed polite on the surface but carried a tone that felt just slightly off, like a test she had not agreed to take. Lily felt it before she could fully define it. The resistance, the quiet. Pushback from those who saw her not as an asset, but as a disruption, and at the center of it all was someone who had been watching far more closely than anyone else. Victor Langford, the chief financial officer. A man whose calm demeanor and measured words made him seem untouchable, yet whose eyes lingered on Lily with a kind of calculated interest that made her instinctively cautious. The first real sign came during a board meeting when Victor casually redirected a discussion she had influenced days earlier, reframing her suggestions as risky and proven, even irresponsible, his tone smooth, controlled, persuasive enough that no one questioned it immediately, and Lily sat there, feeling the shift in the room, the subtle erosion of credibility that could happen without a single direct accusation. And she understood then that this was not just about business. This was about control, about someone who had too much to lose if the structure of the company changed in ways he could not predict. Later that evening, she found herself alone again in the office. The same quiet space that had once felt unfamiliar, now carrying a different kind of tension. And as she reviewed the financial reports, something began to stand out more clearly than before, patterns that did not just suggest inefficiency, but something deeper, discrepancies that repeated too precisely to be accidental, small enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent enough to create significant impact over time. And as she traced the numbers back, her chest tightened slightly, because the trail did not lead to random departments or isolated errors. It led consistently toward one place, one set of approvals, one name. That appeared more often than it should have. Victor Langford. Lily leaned back slightly, her mind racing, because this was no longer just about improving operations or fixing inefficiencies. This was about uncovering something that could change everything. And yet she hesitated. Not because she doubted what she was seeing, but because she understood the risk of being wrong, or worse, the risk of being right in a world where she still did not fully belong. When Ethan entered the room, his presence immediately grounding the space. She looked up, the weight of the discovery still fresh in her thoughts, and for a moment, she considered telling him everything, laying out the pattern, the suspicion, the possibility that someone inside his trusted circle was quietly undermining the company. But something stopped her, not fear exactly, but caution, because trust was not something that could be assumed, not even now, not even between them. "You look like you found something," Ethan said, his voice low, observant as always, and Lily met his gaze, searching for certainty, for a sign that this was a line she could cross safely. But all she saw was the same complexity that had been there from the beginning. A man who was learning to see her differently, but who still lived in a world where loyalty and power were tightly bound together. And so she chose her words carefully. "I think there is more going on than what we are seeing on the surface," she said, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, sharper now, more alert. "Then show me," he replied. And in that moment, Lily realized that whatever came next would not just test the company, it would test everything between them, because once the truth begins to surface, it does not stop until everything hidden is brought into the light. Ethan did not wait. Not this time, because something in Lily's voice had shifted from observation to certainty, and that was not something he could ignore. So within 24 hours, a closed board meeting was called, not the usual polished discussion behind glass walls, but something tighter, more controlled, a room where every word carried weight and every silence meant something was about to break. Lily stood just outside at first, her reflection faint against the darkened glass, the contract she once signed now feeling distant compared to the reality she was stepping into. Because this was no longer about playing a role. This was about stepping into a truth that could either solidify her place or destroy it entirely. And when Ethan opened the door and looked at her, there was no hesitation in his expression, only a quiet expectation. "Come in," he said, and that alone changed everything. Because he was not hiding her anymore. He was placing her directly in the center of it. The room fell silent as she entered, eyes turning, some surprised, some skeptical, and one in particular, Victor Langford, whose calm expression did not change, though something behind his gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly, and Lily felt it. The moment where everything narrowed down to what she would say next, because once spoken, there would be no taking it back. Ethan took his seat, but did not lead the conversation immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked toward Lily just once, a silent signal that this was her moment, and she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension pressing in from every side. The company is not just losing efficiency, she began, placing a set of printed reports on the table. It is being drained through repeated approval patterns that should not exist. And the words landed heavier than she expected, because they were not vague, not theoretical, they were direct. And as she walked them through the numbers, the patterns, the repeated authorizations that bypassed standard review, the room shifted, skepticism turning into something more focused, more alert, and Victor finally leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, almost dismissive. These are serious claims, he said, based on incomplete interpretations. And Lily met his gaze without flinching, because she had prepared for this, not just the data, but the response. Then explain why the same adjustments appear under your authorization across multiple departments, she replied, her tone measured but firm. And for the first time, a pause followed his composure, subtle but undeniable, and that was all it took, because Ethan leaned forward then, his voice no longer neutral. Answer the question, he said, and the room held its breath in that moment, because power was shifting in real time, and everyone could feel it. Victor recovered quickly, offering explanations that sounded structured, reasonable even, but something had already changed. The certainty that once protected him was no longer absolute, and as more questions followed, more details surfaced, the pattern became harder to dismiss, harder to explain away, until the silence that settled over the room was no longer neutral. It was heavy with realization, with the understanding that something had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Lily stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but because she had said what needed to be said, and now the outcome no longer belonged to her alone. And as she glanced at Ethan, she saw it clearly, the shift in him, not just as a CEO responding to a crisis, but as someone who was beginning to see the full scope of what had almost been lost, not just in his company, but in the trust he had placed so carefully. And as the meeting moved toward decisions that would change everything moving forward, one truth stood undeniable in the room. The woman who had once cleaned their floors in silence had just exposed what no one else had been willing to see, and nothing would remain the same after this. The room did not erupt into chaos, not the way people might expect when something hidden is finally revealed. Instead, it grew quieter, heavier, as decisions were made with controlled voices and measured authority. Because in this world, power did not shout, it shifted, and when it did, it was final. Victor Langford was no longer at the center of the table by the time the meeting ended, his composed presence replaced by a silence that said more than any argument could. And as the board members filed out one by one, their expressions thoughtful, cautious, recalibrating everything they thought they knew, Lily remained where she was for just a moment longer, her hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, grounding herself in the reality of what had just happened. Because this was never supposed to be her place, never supposed to be her fight, and yet she had stepped into it fully, and now there was no going back to being invisible. Ethan stood across the room, watching the space, where everything had just changed, his posture still controlled, but something in his expression different, less guarded, more aware. And when the last door closed, leaving only the two of them, the silence between them felt deeper than before, not uncertain, but significant, as if everything unsaid was finally ready to surface. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because some moments require stillness before anything else can follow. Ethan was the one who broke it, stepping closer, his voice quieter than it had ever been, not for effect, but because it no longer needed to carry authority. You saw what no one else did, he said, and Lily met his gaze, not with pride, not with hesitation, but with the same steady clarity that had brought her this far. I just looked where no one was paying attention, she replied, and something about that answer settled between them, simple but undeniable. Because it was not just about the company. It was about perspective, about value that had been overlooked simply because it did not come from the expected place. Ethan exhaled slowly, a small release of tension that had been building far longer than she realized. And then he reached into his jacket, pulling out the one thing that had started all of this, the contract, still folded, still intact, a symbol of everything that had defined their relationship from the beginning. And without ceremony, without hesitation, he placed it on the table between them, his eyes never leaving hers as he did something that carried more meaning than any words he could have chosen. He tore it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room, final in a way that made everything else feel secondary. "This does not define you," he said, his voice steady but different. "Now, no longer transactional, no longer distant. And it does not define us." And Lily looked at the torn pages for a second, not because she needed to see them, but because she understood what they represented, the line that had once separated obligation from choice, now gone. And when she looked back at him, there was no contract, no role, no clear path forward, just something real and unspoken standing between them. "Then what does?" she asked softly, not as a challenge, but as a question. That mattered, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because for the first time, this was not a decision he could calculate, not something he could solve with strategy or control. And when he finally spoke, his words were simple, but they carried a weight that made everything else fall away. "What we choose next," he said. And for the first time since this began, Lily felt something different, not uncertainty, not obligation, but possibility, something open, something unstructured, something real. And as they stood there, no longer bound by a contract but connected by everything they had faced together, one truth remained clear. The life they had started as a transaction had become something neither of them could have planned, and whatever came next would not be written in ink or outlined in terms. It would be built in moments like this, where choice mattered more than anything else.